Hello and welcome to another virtual National Quilting Day lecture. Up next, we have Lauren Hansen, Curator of International Collections at the International Quilt Museum. I'm Laura Chapman. Before we begin, I would like to thank our National Quilting Day sponsors, the Lincoln Quilters Guild, Lincoln Modern Quilt Guild, Nebraska State Quilt Guild, AccuQuilt, Orifil, Handy Quilter, Bernina Sewing Center, Cosmic Cow, So Creative, and the International Quilt Museum. Now to introduce our next speaker. Lauren Hansen is Curator of International Collections here at the museum. She is responsible for building and interpreting the museum's non-Western collection. Dr. Hansen has been a curator here since 2001, and she served on the board for the nonprofit Quilt Alliance from 2009 to 2017. She earned her Master's of Arts in Museum Studies and Textile History from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and her doctorate in Museum Studies from the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom. Her doctoral research focused on cross-cultural quilt-making practices with particular emphasis on China and the United States, and more specifically, quilts made for Chinese adoptees. Dr. Hansen is co-editor of the American Quilts in the Modern Age catalog, the first publication of the museum's comprehensive series of collections, and she is also managing editor of our World Quilts website, which she's going to talk to you about today. With that, welcome, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Laura. And happy National Quilting Day, everyone. We are, of course, disappointed that we can't have you with us in person at the International Quilt Museum, but circumstances do not allow us to do that. So we are really happy to be able to do this virtual National Quilting Day instead. And I thought, since we can't bring you to Lincoln, I thought we would bring the world to you, at least a small portion of the quilting world to you via our World Quilts website, which is an ongoing project. We are going to be continuing to add components and modules to it for the foreseeable future because the world of quilts is huge, as we all know. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen. And let's hope the technology works out for us here. So the first thing that I wanted to do is just show you our homepage. This is the internationalquiltmuseum.org homepage. It's really easy to get to the World Quilts site using our homepage. You can simply click on this globe that is up in the top right corner, or you can scroll just a little bit down, take a look at some of our exhibitions, collections, and then right in the middle, nice big words, World Quilts, and link, visit World Quilts. So that's one really good, easy way to do it. And when you click on that link, that takes you to the homepage of the World Quilt site, which shows you the current modules that we have available to you. Those are the American story, the Amish story, the Central Asian story, and the Crazy Quilt story. I'll just give you sort of a brief overview of each one of those, show you some highlights, and then the great thing about these sites is that they're really rich, full of information, full of images. You can really dig in, you know, and it can all depend on what kind of project you have in mind. If you're doing a research project, really great resources here. But if you're looking to make a new quilt, there's lots of inspiration as well. So, you know, we have hundreds and hundreds of images of quilts on these sites. So depending on what you're looking for, what your project or research is looking at, these sites can just be really useful for you in a multitude of ways. So all you have to do is go ahead and click on the link you want to go to. So in this case, the American story. And the way we organize these sites is a little bit different than you might expect, because when you think about American quilt history, you might think of sort of a timeline, or you might think about geography. But what we wanted to do was identify themes that brought different kinds of quilts together across history and across the country. So the themes we identified, you can see right up at the top here. It says quilts are business, creativity, identity, and engagement. So we're currently on the home page, and that's why that is highlighted right now. But if we click on Quilts Are, and it's a little bit slow right now, this is a great page just with some basic information. So this would be a great spot if you have some friends who maybe just don't even know the first thing about quilts. What is a quilt? How are they made? What are the components of a quilt? And then we go into some other basic information, but also we address some of the myths that surround quilts, which is always interesting. We know that there are some myths about quilt making. For instance, that all quilts were made of scraps. We know, looking through our collection, certainly that not all quilts are made from scraps. In fact, from very early on, quilts were intended to feature the most expensive fabrics and to really showcase the wealth of the maker or the receiver. So this section can help start to do a little bit of myth busting for you and provide you with some extra resources for how to dig deeper there. But as we move into all of these separate themes, so for instance, business, we do address it. It's somewhat chronologically. So in the business section, we talk about really early textile trade. Then we go into the Industrial Revolution, birth of modern quilt businesses. So that would be more like the early 20th century. And we bring it all the way down to the digital age. So today, what drives the quilt making business world? If you're a quilt maker, you certainly know that it's big business. And when you go into your quilt shop, there's lots and lots of merchandise to choose from, and there are quilt shops all across the country. So it is big business. When you click on one of these, you start to go deeper into that topic then. So for instance, in the birth of the modern quilt business, you can look at images, and these are all clickable. And then you can actually zoom into some of these images. I'll actually go to the first one here because this shows some of the marketing that was done early in the 20th century for some of the earliest quilt businesses. Marie Webster, she was an early quilt designer, and she really had a thriving business based on the designs she made, and her style really started to define early 20th century quilts. So whether you're looking to learn more about early quilt businesses, or you just want to learn more about Marie Webster, or you want to, you love that early 20th century design look, right here, just this single image could help you out. As we move through all of these sections, you find different topics. Under creativity, we look at the idea of everyday creativity. We look at professional quilt makers, again, people like Marie Webster, but then moving on into more recent times, quilts as art. You know, quilts weren't really thought formally as art until the 20th century. But certainly since the quilt revival from the 1970s or so onward, they've definitely become a really legitimate form of fine art. Lots of people who trained as fine artists have chosen quilt making as their primary medium. So we talk a lot about how that phenomenon developed, but then we also talk about, again, in terms of everyday quilt making, groups and guilds. I bet a lot of us are members of guilds, and making quilts with others has always been a really important part of American quilt history. So we kind of dig deeper into that history. Now you'll notice on some of these pages, there are text areas that are bold and in red. Those represent links where you go to either an external site that provides more legitimate, really beefy or meaty information, or it goes to another World Quilts page. So you can really start to dig deep. And the other thing you can see on these pages is off to the left, there's a column that says resources. And that's where we provide you with scholarly articles, books, exhibitions. Again, it really allows you to dig deep into whatever topic you're most interested in at that moment. As we move forward, we look at the idea of identity. A lot of people take their identity from being a quilt maker, or they express their own group identity in their quilts. So we look at gender, we look at race, class, ethnicity. These are all things that have come into play in quilt making. And then the final topic, looking at quilts as a form of engagement, because a lot of people have used their quilt making to express themselves during times of war and peace. You can see the topics over on the left here. For commemoration, whether it's political commemoration or more personal commemoration, fundraising and charity. Even today, we raise lots of money making quilts, whether it's a church or if it's for a specific health need of someone we know. And then finally, awareness and activism is the final topic that we have in the topic of engagement. And that includes historically, abolition and temperance are addressed here. And then we look at politics throughout the ages. Women have, even when they were unable to vote, women made their voices heard through quilt making and other expressive means. So the American story, that was the first module we produced, but we really knew from the very beginning that we wanted to keep adding modules to showcase our research, to showcase the exhibitions we have curated, and really to showcase our collections, because our collections really do reflect the whole world. Our goal is to raise awareness and share global quilt making with as wide an audience as we possibly can. And doing it on a website is a perfect way, especially these days when we're all practicing social distancing. So you'll see at the top of each of the modules that these areas are clickable. There's a search bar, so if there's a specific term you're looking for, log cabin or crazy quilts or something like that, you can search there. If you want to just go back to the International Quilt Museum's main homepage, just click right on our logo. And then on the left, you can always go back to the World Quilts site by just clicking on this upper left-hand area here. So as soon as you click on that, you go back to the homepage like that. And this is where I'll just quickly show you a few of these other modules. The Amish story talks about Amish quilt making since the 19th century, how it developed. The tabs here you'll see are historical Amish quilt making, the discovery, the response, and a living tradition, because quilts are still being made in Amish communities and people are making Amish style quilts. A few of the things that I wanted to point out on this website include the fact that we've included some video and audio clips, and hopefully this will work here. So for instance, on the landing page, as we call it, for the discovery, we have Jonathan Holstein, who's a quilt collector and historian, talking about the very first Amish quilt that he collected, that he and his wife Gail Vanderhoof collected. And it's a really great clip. I'll just play it for a second and see if it works here. It's a 2.5-minute clip of him just talking about that exciting moment.
This bars quilt was the first Amish quilt that Gail and I ever found. And it was covering the springs of a brass bed in a little antique shop on Route 30 in Pennsylvania, one of our stops in our what had become an endless quest for
it's
quilts.
Really fascinating to get to hear straight from Jonathan Holstein, who really was instrumental in sort of kicking off that quilt interest in quilts, that quilt revival of the 1970s. So to hear him reminisce about what it was like to discover the first quilt that he had in his collection is pretty neat. We also have, so the scholar we worked with, and that's another thing I'll mention, is that we do work with lots of internal scholars, our own curators, but we work with tons of scholars from outside the International Quilt Museum. And for this one, the lead scholar was Janniken Smucker, who is a top researcher on Amish quilts and Amish communities. And she, in this website, we feature some of the oral histories she performed with Amish quilt makers themselves, but also with collectors. So here we've got audio clips of people who purchased quilts and started the whole rage for collecting Amish quilts in the 1980s. So I would encourage you that if you're really interested in Amish quilts and want to dig into the history of not just the Amish quilts themselves and the makers, but also really into the cultural phenomenon of them becoming collectible and starting to command top dollar prices at auctions, especially in the late 80s and 90s. This is a really great site for you to get started on that topic. So I'll go back and just briefly introduce you to the Central Asian story. This was a companion site to an exhibition we did called Sacred Scraps, Quilt and Patchwork Traditions of Central Asia. Beautiful exhibition. So it introduces you to styles of patchwork that you may not be familiar with already. And it's wonderful because it really helps us understand that quilts and patchwork really are found almost all over the world. And the way they're used is different in different parts of the world. So in Central Asia, patchwork really is expressive of spiritual protection. In a lot of ways, patchwork functions as a way to protect especially children and families from any unknown forces or just sickness. You want your family to stay healthy, and patchwork is one way that quilt makers or women in these parts of the world have used that form of sewing. So sacred scraps is one topic. Rites of passage is another on the site. So we're all familiar with making quilts and patchwork for things like weddings and births, and it's the same in places like Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. So in that part of the world, people make patchwork much in the same way we do for birth and childhood. There's a whole section here that showcases some of the patchwork clothing, especially that's made for children. In areas of the world, you know, in the early 20th century or before, when birth rates or mortality rates were so high, it makes sense that women would want to do everything they could to protect their children. And patchwork was believed to be one way of doing that. So again, on these sites, you can really start to dig in. We have really good resources on the left-hand side that you can click and start to dig into some more scholarly articles about these topics. The final site and the most recent one we launched is the Crazy Quilt Story, which was really fun. We worked with Dr. Susan Marks, who's a UK scholar, and so we were able to get sort of a cross-cultural perspective on this one. Lots of us are familiar with crazy quilts. I think we're less familiar with British crazy quilts over here in the US. So it was really wonderful to be able to compare and contrast what British and American quilts looked like and what some of the different origins were for these similar but divergent quilts. And I think I'm having a little bit of a slowdown here. Okay, so when you click on origins, this is where you can sort of get your feet wet, learn about, you know, what is a crazy quilt, how do we define it, because it can be kind of difficult to define what a crazy quilt really is. What are those factors that make something a crazy quilt? Then we dig into some of the influences from Asia. In the 19th century, we were Europeans and Americans were learning about the East to a great degree, and we were incorporating a lot of those design and style influences into our own home furnishings and artwork even. European influences, and then we looked a little bit at what the fashion was in the UK and what the fashion was in the US. So in the UK, of course, you know, we are less need tea cozies as often as they do in the UK. So you can see here that one of the objects we featured on that site was a tea cozy, and My internet connection is pretty slow right now. I get the feeling that with so many universities and schools shut down, lots of people are on the internet right now, so things are very slow. But as you can see here in the UK, things like tea cozies became an expression, a crazy quilt form of expression. I think it's gonna pull up. It was wonderful to be able to borrow images from places like the Quilters Guild collection. And so here we have a really beautifully decorated tea cozy. I would be certainly afraid of getting it stained and messy, but the maker was able to showcase her embroidery skills, and she really was showing how fashionable she was by making this tea cozy. So again, you can really dig into the ideas of the surrounding crazy quilts, what their origins were, what they looked like, what the aesthetics were of crazy quilts. Didn't appear out of nowhere. There were lots of different cultural streams, cultural threads coming together that led to the explosion of crazy work. So we look at what women's lives were like, gender and identity. We looked at science and technology, marketing and advertising was really starting to come to its own in the late 19th century. So you're able to dig into advertising and how manufacturers were pushing, silk scraps or silk threads to quilt a crazy quilt. I was really excited to work directly on this one because we look then at the further influence of crazy quilts around the world, because we often think of them as a very American or British style, but then we look at other parts of the world where the crazy look is also quite prevalent. So whether it's in the British Empire, some of the other parts of the British colonial world, or whether it's in Japan, East Asia, or today, we close out the site with a section called Crazy Art, where you can look at contemporary quilt makers who use that crazy style or that really embellished style in their expression. So that was a whirlwind tour of the World Quilt sites. Again, I will just encourage you to just dive in. They're really easy. You can jump all over the place. That's kind of the dangers, that you might get sucked in for longer than you were expecting to. But you can always come back and you'll always find something new on the World Quilt sites. And they're easy to find. Once again, I'll go to our homepage here. And if you scroll down to the middle, you can click right on the Visit World Quilts. Or if you go up to the very top and click on the little globe, you'll get there as well. So I'm going to stop sharing, I think, and say thank you. I hope you are enjoying our virtual National Quilting Day. We have lots of great things on tap for you throughout the day. So enjoy, and we hope that as soon as the health situation has cleared up, that you'll come visit us again in person in Lincoln at the International Quilt Museum. Thanks, everyone.